Go right ahead.
Ned, thank you very much, Dennis. Ned, I'd like to first begin by apologizing to those of you out there. Um, the technology, some of these technologies can be so baffling that you had problems from the very beginning. However, we're now off and running, and I'll try and keep this thing to within an hour or less than an hour. The American Civil War, as you know, is the most catastrophic event that ever happened to the United States. And when it happened in 1861, at the same time, as horrible as the war was, it also offered several unique opportunities to women to help free them from the boundaries that had been set up for them. And they weren't aware of it at the time because there were certain things they weren't allowed to do. The Civil War produced 750,000 dead, over 1.5 million people wounded. I believe this photograph you see here was taken at Gettysburg. It's interesting to note that after July 3rd, we hear about Pickett's famous charge when the Union Army was going over the battlefield and looking at the dead and wounded Confederate soldiers. One of them was found to be a female. Okay, but the trauma of the Civil War has to include the impact that it had on women. Not only did it affect them, but it gave them it gave them the ability to see there were other things they could do with their lives besides stay home. You have to look at the culture at the time. Excuse me, I'm running ahead of myself. Okay. These are monuments which are made to Southern women up and down the East Coast of the United States. You have monuments to women in the Civil War. The difference is this, that in the South, they have these incredible, very expensive and beautiful monuments and made strictly for women. However, where it came to Northern monuments, as a rule, excuse me, as a rule, the monuments were not as expensive. These are two of them. One is in Boston, Massachusetts, and the other one is in Galesburg, Illinois. And it's made out to a woman whose name was, she was known as Mother Bicketike. This was a woman who literally ran into the battlefield to help women soldiers. But there was a tremendous need for women. In Washington, D.C., this is a monument to nuns who served as nurses during the Civil War. And there were 8 different orders of them. To understand what women went through in that period, you have to examine the culture in which they lived. It was referred to as the culture or cult of domesticity, consisting of 4 things. Women were expected to be obedient to their husbands and accept their leadership. The domesticity, the idea was to raise children, cook, clean, and sew, and piety, devotion to Christian principles. And of course, they were expected to be virgins on their wedding night. Try telling that to women in today's times. If you see this particular illustration, you notice she's got a smile on her face. She's very happy. She's cooking dinner or lunch, and at the same time, she's got her laundry, and she's happy doing these things. But this is the way people felt in those days. You're talking about the women who live in an entirely different culture in 1861 compared to today. Today, if you wanted dinner tonight, if you wanted a roast chicken, you simply went to the supermarket and did it and purchased one. You couldn't do that in 1861. You had to go into the farm and chase chickens around the yard to get one. Totally different environment, and this is what was expected of them. The vast majority of them accepted it. However, there were changes taking place. There was a very strong women's anti-slave movement. Most of them were suffragettes, the women who wanted to get the right to vote, and also provide opportunities for them to do different things with their life, other than stay home and raise a family. Now, granted, probably the overwhelming majority of women were content to lead that kind of life, but certainly not. There were also a large numbers of women who wanted an opportunity to do something else. Women were playing a major role in the media war against slavery with public lectures. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Basically, originally was a series of of chapters in magazine. Then it became a book, and then it became a play. It was an international success. Women were very influential. They were educators, and they were public speakers, and they went all over the country talking about the evils of abolition. about the evils of slavery. And the women like Susan Anthony and Lucy Stowe, they gathered 400,000 signatures to abolish slavery at a time when the population in the North was about 22 million. In the South, there was 13 million, of which 4 million were slaves who couldn't vote, had absolutely no rights. And so you had 9 million in the South. They weren't as enthusiastic about women's rights as they were in the North, but this was a very solid movement and was gaining society. Now the Civil War starts and women start getting involved in huge numbers. Now this had never happened before. Women were involved in the Revolution to a small extent and maybe a lesser extent in the War of 1842. But the Civil War was when women really came into their own. With the Federal Army in 1861 at 16,000, the federal government needed all the help they could get. So women started the aid societies to help wounded soldiers, up to 20,000 women on both sides volunteered, and they also helped destitute widows. Now, this would have been very important in the South, which didn't have the resources that the North did, whereas the federal government was helping the women of soldiers who had died or were badly wounded. They didn't have that luxury in the South. They didn't have as much money, so they weren't able to vote as much. They had the Sanitary Commission, organized by civilians, and their function was to prevent disease by improving sanitary conditions in military camps. There was the U.S. Christian Commission, which consisted of 5,000 men and women who visited battlefields, camps, and prisons, and they assisted doctors. This had never been done before. And women had to leave their homes in large numbers to be involved in this thing. Before, they were just expected to stay home. But now they're going to meetings, they're going to these places where soldiers have to be taken care of. And they're doing all these things, and they're discovering something new about themselves. This is a propaganda photo taken during the Civil War. It shows two women very well dressed. You can tell by their hairstyles, these are women of position, and they're out there working on something. These are all pedal-operated sewing machines. Chances are they wouldn't be doing it that way. They'd be using homespun. The impact on women in the Civil War was determined by social class and geography. Northern women suffered little devastation of food shortages. The damage was done principally in the South. It wasn't rebel armies that were running amok in the North. It was Northern armies that were running in the South and dividing up the country. Northern women were able to maintain their material lifestyles. In fact, many ran the family business or found administrative jobs. The skills they developed enhanced their equal rights activities after the war. Now, this is a period with the gathering experience. The gathering experience as nurses, as administrators. They're writing books, they're traveling, they're giving lectures. They hadn't done that before to the extent that they're now doing it between 1861 and 1865. Low-income women were different, but they found plenty of work with them. But when you could take a look at this photograph, you can see what they were exposed to. They're dealing with gunpowder. I think they're making bullet cartridges. That gunpowder is going all over the clothes, out to stopping for coffee or for lunch, probably ingesting it. A very unsafe occupation. Southern women had to donate the urine to help make, which is used to make potassium nitrate, which is necessary to make gunpowder. They literally had a wagon being brought down the street, and the women were simply donating the urine, and they used the chemicals inside to make it. This is considered a patriotic thing to do. Wealthy white Southern women didn't have much to worry about. They simply ran the plantations, the farms, where they obtained important administrative positions. They joined the aid societies in the South, or they volunteered as nurses. However, anything demeaning was generally assigned to low-income whites as slaves. At war's end, most decided to restore their former lives with little time for the suffragette movement, which became mostly a northern enterprise until the 1870s and 1880s. Low-income whites suffered tremendously in the South because they were unable to care for their farms. Many of these women were forced to return to prostitution. They could have had 4, 5, or 6 children to support, and they couldn't do that by themselves. The South also had class warfare issues. Under the 20 Negro Law, plantation owners were exempt from the draft. So the poor generally regarded the Civil War as the rich man's war. This is something I think I don't want to get involved with politics, but we tend to think that the South is all racist monsters. Large numbers of the men in the South were only fighting because they were drafted. They had no choice in the matter, just as lower income men in the North did. They had nothing to gain by the war. They didn't own slaves. Excuse me. What many of these women were doing is they were sending letters home to their husbands, telling them to, in the army, telling them to desert and to come home because they were hungry. There was no food. All right. Black women had the worst of all, but while the male slaves were conscripted to go to the front, women and children had to assume greater workloads, and many of them fled the plantation to follow the Union Army. Personally, I think that one of the great tragedies of the 1930s was Gone with the Wind, because it presented a terrible lie. It showed people, slaves, being happy to be slaves, despising the Union Army. They felt they were part of the family. They felt sympathetic towards the Confederate soldiers. That simply was not true. They hated being slaves. Who would be happy being a slave? It didn't make any sense. And as soon as they could, they ran off to plantations and they followed the Union soldiers. The North practiced total war. While there's plenty of food, there's plenty of manufactured goods in the North, you don't have that in the South. The Union military strategy was to inflict as much misery on civilians, including a Union naval blockade, that archaic railway system. There was confiscation by the food. Also, plantation owners were uneager to grow food. They wanted to grow tobacco, cotton, and rice because that was a cash crop. They weren't interested in feeding their own people. Sherman's army, when they marched from Atlanta, Georgia, to Savannah, Georgia, destroyed 300 miles of railway track. They also confiscated and destroyed 13 million tons of corn, including 130,000 cattle and unknown quantities of pigs and chickens. The idea was starve the South, create so much misery that these people will throw in the towel. And I think, to a large extent, it worked. There were tremendous desertions in the Confederate Army. In 1863, you had food riots in Richmond. Women grabbed pistols and clubs. There's no food. They simply marched into Washington, smashed open the windows, and they grabbed whatever food they could. The Confederate government responded to that with cash grants to the poor and government, the stores that sold affordable products, food. In 1863, it was a disaster for the Confederacy. We all know what happened at Gettysburg. Lee's army sustains 28,000 casualties, and he heads north. But what's not discussed as much is what happened the next day on July 4th. Confederate General Pemberton surrenders his entire army of 29,500 men to General Grant. And by doing that, the Union Army is now in control of the Mississippi and prevents food and supplies from getting through to the South from the Midwest. The South, they can't destroy. There's nothing they can do to stop it. During the 47 days of civilian at Vicksburg, civilians lived in caves and they ate dogs, cats, they even ate rats. That's how horrible it was, and that's what motivated General Pemberton to surrender his army. He knew what his own troops were starving, as well as the people in the town. He had no choice. Okay, New York City draft riots, 1863. There are many reasons for these riots, but the horror of the riots was that black men were being lynched. They set fire to a black orphanage, young girls. Thank God the girls got out okay. Large numbers of men were lynched. I think it may have been, one figure I read was 22, another was 119, another was 1,200. The figure seems to be obscure, but they rebelled against an unfair draft system which ignited racial and class tensions. Numerous women were involved in these things, and here's the reason why. You're a poor immigrant. You have 4, 5, or 6 children. The only work your husband can do is work down at the docks. Now he's got to compete with African Americans coming up from leaving the plantations. Now, if they could avoid the draft, that they were paid if they could find someone, or they could pay $300, but they couldn't do that. Meanwhile, blacks were excluded from the draft. So the attitude was, why in the world should we be drafted and fight for a cause we don't believe in, when the very blacks who tend to benefit from this war aren't required to serve? But they did. I'm not making any excuses. I'm just telling you that was the thinking at the time. It created so much racial unrest and hatred that the riots were inevitable. Lincoln sends in the unit from Gettysburg. They fire on the crowd and they stop it. And eventually the immigrants realize they have to serve in the army. Large numbers of women became nurses. Clara Barton was known as the angel of the battlefield. She was an ardent abolitionist and suffragette. She worked as a nurse in the combat zone. In fact, she even went into the battlefield while the firing was going on to grab wounded Union soldiers. After the war, she aided families to find soldiers, and in 1880, she became president of the American Red Cross. Sally Lewis of Tompkins was on the Confederate side. She used her own money to finance a hospital, and they had the lowest fatality rate of any Confederate hospital. She lived her final days in poverty in the Confederate Women's Home in Richmond. Murray Walker was a Union surgeon, which is very rare because women were not encouraged to go to medical school, because it was generally assumed that eventually they get married, they'd have children, they wouldn't serve as doctors, they were occupying a seat that a male could take up. Now, of course, we think entirely differently today, but 1861, that was the culture at the times. She was a combat surgeon. She also served as a spy. She was a woman's rights advocate. She was the first woman to be awarded the Medal of Honor. She was a remarkable woman. Here she is dressed as a man. It wasn't uncommon in those days for certain women who had high administrative jobs to dress as a woman. As a man. But she was married, and but this is how she chose to dress. When at the very beginning, women were never encouraged to become nurses because it was considered unseemly for a woman, a married woman, a single, to see a man without his clothes on. That's how they thought. However, they needed nurses as the casualties amounted up. Look, at Gettysburg alone, you have 28,000 casualties on both sides. You need nurses. What they did was, Dorothea Dix, who was superintendent of the Army nurses, they only wanted women who were 30 years of age and plain, almost to repulsion of dress and devoid of personal attractions. They had to be responsible maternal volunteers who would not distract or behave in unseemly or unfeminine ways. Now, of course, you could never do that today, all right? There's a reason why they did it. I'm going to ask you to have an open mind. Do not apply the thinking of 2021 to 1860 or 1863. You have men being killed by the thousands every year. Remember, 750,000 dead in the space of 4 years. They needed women. What Dorothea Dix did not want, she didn't want young flirty girls looking for adventure, maybe shopping for a husband. That's not the kind of women they were looking for. They were looking for mature women who take their responsibilities very seriously and were there only to help the wounded soldiers. A female nurse was paid $1,200 a month. A male nurse was paid $20. Now, of course, that's ridiculous now, but that's the way they were back in those days. It's interesting to note that only 50% of nurses accepted pay. The rest did it because they wanted to do it, because they felt obligated to help people. This is an actual dress of a Civil War nurse. These are all blood stains over here. Okay, this is a man. This is the sides these women were exposed to. We don't know how many of them were emotionally affected by all this. Here's a man who lost part of his face. How were these two people supposed to function in a normal society? What kind of work could they do? Many of them would have to be supported by the families forever. There were 8 different Catholic orders who participated as nurses. And if you had asked any one of them, would they accept a salary, they probably would have been insulted. Large numbers of women served as spies. Now, we all know movies, right? Movies tell us that a lot of these female spies were beautiful and sultry and sexy, and they knew how to manipulate men. Well, to a certain extent, that was true. That's history. Here's Belle Boyd. She was a Confederate spy. At the age of 17, she kills a Union soldier who's having a heated argument with her mother. She spied for Stonewall Jackson. She had a crush on him. She was arrested 16 times and married a Union officer. Eventually, she became an actress. She billed herself as the Cleopatra to secession and the rebel Joan of Arc. She had 3 husbands and 4 children. It all caught up with her at 56. She was married to a man who was 17 years younger. She was 56. She was 39. He was 39. The poor woman died of a heart attack, understandably, at age 56. Antonia Ford, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Antonia Ford was a very attractive woman. There was a man in town named Joseph Willard who was in love with her. He wanted to marry her. She said no. Anyway, she becomes a Confederate spy for Jeb Stuart and Colonel Mosby. She gets captured. She's in prison. And who turns out to be her jailer? Joseph Willard. Well, he makes sure she gets clothing, blankets, food, medicine, whatever she needs. He's constantly sending letters to Washington saying she's no longer a threat. She should be released. Eventually, she gained her freedom. But at this point, she couldn't say no to him. He had been so devoted to her. She married him in 1864. But regrettably, they did have 3 children, but 2 of them died in infancy, and Antonia died in 1871. Now, I was asked in other classes whether women participated as combatants, and the answer is yes. Nobody knows for sure exactly how many women there were. It's believed there were between 450, 750 women who disguised themselves as men on both sides. Male soldiers who served with them attested to the bravery. These women are very good at hiding who they were. After the war, many families were embarrassed by the service. It was considered unseemly for a woman to do that. Some critics refer to them as unbalanced lesbians or prostitutes, but of course they weren't that. They were women who were patriotic. A lot of them wanted to be with their husbands or with their boyfriends, or simply felt an obligation to serve. They were motivated by patriotism, no other reason. After the war, many wrote books and spoke publicly of their experiences. In fact, by the 1880s and 90s, these former soldiers have become admired celebrities and role models of the suffragette movement. One of them was Frances Clayton. She fought 18 battles. She went to war with her husband. You talk about women who stand by their men. Frances joins the army with her husband, participates in 18 battles. She's the mother of 3. And she learned how to smoke, chew tobacco, drink, swear, act like a man so that nobody would know what she really was. They were about to charge the Confederate lines. Her husband is standing next to her and he gets killed, gets shot. What does she do? She picks up her rifle, fixes bayonets, and charges the Confederate lines. This was the caliber of the women you had who joined the military. This was Jennie Rogers. Jennie Rogers enlisted as a man in 1862. She served in 3 years. She fought in over 40 engagements. And after the war, she lived her entire life as a man, always in men's occupations, disguised as a man. Eventually, senility set in, and she went to a home where her identity was discovered. They forced her to wear women's clothes and women's shoes. The problem is she didn't know how to walk in women's shoes, and her mind wasn't all there. She fell down. She broke her hip. Jennie never recovered from that thing. She spent most of her life in bed, and she died in, I think it's 19, I can't read the entire slide, but she died, I think, she died in 1915. She's buried in a military cemetery under her male name. These women were held in very high regard, right, because the men they served with spoke about how brave they were, how good they were. And if they did know, they kept their mouths shut. They locked, because then once they found out, the Army found out there was a female in the ranks, she was cashiered out. They gave her money and they sent her home. That's all. However, she died in 1915, I believe. The Vandiers were women, they would call them daughters of the regiment. They were aides-de-camps, they assisted soldiers, they did cooking, laundering, some sold liquor to make a few bucks. This is Mary Tippy, very well known. This is her 44 caliber pistol. When the Confederates would charge the Union lines, she would simply get up and start shooting with them. This was a woman to be taken very seriously. She wouldn't take any nonsense at all from the Confederates. These two women, these are teenagers. If your father was a high-ranking officer in a regiment, they bring in their 18, 19-year-old daughters. They participate in parades, and they do whatever they could to make the soldiers' life easier. They were held in very high regard. And over the years, as the soldiers are having reunions, they welcome the sight of these women coming to them. Okay. Then, of course, there were the camp followers. There were two groups. The first group consisted of women, mostly poor, who followed their husbands, boyfriends. They cooked their laundries and found other useful chores. The second group consisted of prostitutes who created nothing but chaos and mayhem for the soldiers. They gave them venereal disease for which there was no cure. This particular woman, you talk about women who stand by their man, she's got 3 children over here, including the infant. He's the husband. When you take a close look at this photograph, she's kind of has this expression on her face which says, what the hell am I doing here? I'm going to do all this work. I might as well be home where it's more comfortable. But this is what women did. Okay. Revenge of the Southern Belles. This is worth talking about. Women in New Orleans, which was an occupied city by the North, they showed contempt for Union soldiers. They spit on them. They called them names. Things boiled over. One of these women was on a balcony, and she emptied a chamber pot filled with you-know-what on the head of a Union soldier. Union General Butler went ballistic over that thing. He ordered any woman who showed disrespect to a Union officer armed to be arrested as a prostitute. This was an incredible insult to fine Southern ladies. You just couldn't do that to them. Even the hookers were annoyed. They didn't like that. However, these women had to behave themselves. A few of them went to jail for a week or so, then they were let out. These women are seething with rage, and they're wondering, what can they want to get back at General Butler for this horrendous insult, and they're wondering how to do it. And one of them comes up with an absolutely brilliant idea. They came up with a chamber pot, and they put General Butler's photograph at the bottom of it. If you could find this thing in an antique store today, it'd be worth a fortune. I don't know what General Butler did. I never read of him taking any action against it, but I thought it was just hilarious the way they did it. Okay, Civil War casualties were horrendous. Deaths from wounds actually was only 33%. Deaths from disease were 500. So 67% of all deaths in the Civil War were from disease, not from battle wounds. Now, what was killing them? Well, it would be dysentery, gangrene, malaria, measles, smallpox, scurvy, strep throat, French mouth, and of course, venereal disease. Okay. This is a nurse. Nurses were not immune from the hazards. If they were in a hospital taking care of soldiers with all kinds of disease, some of them would get the disease. All right. There was no protection. There's no penicillin. There's no antibiotics. As a result, these women died. This particular nurse, shown on display here in the coffin in 1864, she's holding a Bible. Okay. The high casualty rate, another reason why you had all these high casualty rates, was the hospitals are overwhelmed. There's lack of surgical expertise, non-sterile environment, there's little clean water, there's no antibiotics. This is a boy, he's 14 years old, he's a Confederate kid. He was killed in the trenches of Petersburg. Can you imagine what his mother must have gone through when she saw this photograph? 14 years old and killed. What kind of people were these that accept 14-year-olds? The aftermath was that the country was altered forever. Over 500,000 soldiers were permanently disabled, and many suffered permanent psychological damage. The women suffered psychological damage who were in the hospitals, who were exposed to all this. Entire towns were devoid of young men, making it difficult for women to get husbands. And the burden with women with wounded loved ones increased. Women have to find work, care for men, and raise children in an age where there aren't that many jobs for women. Where are they supposed to work? Maybe if they had an education, they can get a job as a school teacher, maybe work in the law, but that's about it. Particularly in the South, they're destitute, they have nothing. And look what they had to go through. The rebale of Confederate dead. Between 1865 and 1871, Southern women got organized and brought 30,000 Confederate soldiers home for reinterment in Southern military and civilian cemeteries. This is the Hollywood Confederate Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. You have these Confederate cemeteries all over the place. 18,000 soldiers are buried here. This is interesting. This is the only Jewish military cemetery outside of Israel. It's the Jewish Confederate Cemetery in Beth Achabar Synagogue in Richmond, Virginia. My wife and I visited the cemetery. We were there. They had little Confederate flags all over the place. 30 Jewish Confederates are buried here. Now, why were they buried here? Because they wouldn't bury them with Christians. They simply didn't want it. They told them they had to be buried outside the cemetery, and this was considered disrespectful. It was upset the Jewish community tremendously. I mean, here 30 boys had died for the cause, and they were treated with such contempt. They were brought to the cemetery. There's a cemetery in the back of the synagogue, and a special area was set up strictly for them. And there are 30 of them that are buried there now. Okay, poor women wore black armbands or made dresses from the scrap. It all depends on what kind of money you had. Okay. 50% of widows remarried, with many to much older men. For you women in the audience, I want you to consider something. What it was like in that particular period. You're 16 or 17 years old. Out of 200 men who went off from your township, maybe only 30 come back, and out of that 30, maybe some already are engaged to marry. There aren't enough men to go around. Okay, your choice then is to live with your parents or with a relative, but then again, you couldn't be welcome forever because you'd have to be supported. There aren't any jobs. Maybe in the city you could find something, but out in the farmland you couldn't find anything. Which means either you'd have to marry a much older man. We take a look at this. She could be as young as 17 or 18 years of age. He appears to be in his 40s. This is quite common. You had 16 and 17-year-old girls in the South marrying 50-year-old men. The situation wasn't as bad in the North because the North is getting large numbers of immigrants coming in, men of all ages, which provides husbands for women. But that's what it was like. It's not like today. That's all. If you're interested in making acquaintances, there's all kinds of online services. You didn't have that then. And if you lived in a small town, your opportunities to meet weren't very high. If you were a Southern girl and you really were desperate enough, if there was a young Yankee soldier in church looking at you, you may have been tempted to attract his attention and get to know him better. But of course, you couldn't stay married to a Union soldier in the South. It would be a disgrace to your family, so you'd have to leave. Of course, once you went to where your husband lived, they were also mad at you in the North. It was a crisis. Aftermath is that widow's heartbreak. Many wanted to recover the bodies of loved ones, but embalming them before burial was unaffordable to most people. 50% of all dead soldiers, both North and South, were never identified. They were buried in a mass grave. Thousands of bodies were left to rot, partially buried. They were eaten by wild animals. Okay. In 1894, a group of Southern women got organized called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They're still around, though they're more subdued now. They helped to establish the Lost Cause movement, which basically was a lie, in which the South is made to be the victims and the North the perpetrators. Of course, just the opposite is true. When the South fought in Fort Sumter, they fired on the American flag. They were considered to be in rebellion. They were the bad guys, not us. But their mission, as of 1894, now the Confederate veterans are starting to die off, is to keep the memory of them alive and promote the Southern point of view in history books, archives, museums, and statues and monuments. Now, I think it's important to note that not all statues are racist. I know we hear this all the time. Some of the monuments only refer to people who were killed in battle and never came home. It wasn't designed to promote slavery in any way. It was just designed to say 20 boys went off to war, only 15 came back. Here are the 15. We don't know for sure where they're buried. It's worth talking about Elizabeth Thorne. She was a German refugee, her and her husband. Her husband joined the Union Army, and they had worked in a civilian cemetery. There was no national military cemetery in Gettysburg. that point. That didn't happen until November 1863. But she worked in a civilian cemetery. In her 6th month of pregnancy, if you see the statue sideways, you can see she has an extended stomach. Here's her shovel. In the hot days of July and August, this woman dug graves for 91 soldiers and 14 civilians while in her 6th month of pregnancy. 6 months later, she gave birth to a child, to a girl. And her daughter was never right. She was a sickly child, and she died at the age of 14. Elizabeth claimed that the reason why was because she had been under such physical and emotional stress during that period. That's what caused the physical problems with her daughter. I guess we'll never know for sure. But where do you find people like this? Incredible what they did. It's hot as hell. They're wearing these long clothes, and she's digging 91 graves. Amazing. American women were never the same after the Civil War. They developed a new sense of awareness. Up to that time, they were home. A lot of them were active in the suffragette movement, but they never expected to do the things that they were called upon to do. And they did it willingly, and they wanted to help out. Black women, not all of them were poor. Some of them went into the business world and did very, very well. And those that did. In the final analysis, you have to, you have to love and respect these women. These are 3 Union Army nurses. You have to love and respect them because they gave so much of themselves to others. In an age when women were expected to stay home and take care of the families, they went to war. They became nurses. They became spies. They went into the battlefield to retrieve wounded soldiers. They made tremendous sacrifices. They became administrators, writers, authors. They did incredible things. The problem was they never received proper historical credit for what they did. Now, perhaps this is true in all wars, and this permeates throughout our history. When you think of World War II, what do you think? Do you think of the nurses? No. Do you think of General Patton or Eisenhower, or you think of the D-Day invasion? You don't think of the women who took care of it. You don't realize how many of these women had severe emotional problems. Some of them were alcoholics. We don't know what happened to the women who participated in the American Civil War, what impact it had on them, how they were affected. I like to refer to these women as the unsung heroines of the American Civil War. They did incredible things, astonishing things. And today we pay honor to them. We pay homage to them. And what we say is, thank you, ladies, for a job well done. Well, at this point, my program is concluded. I'm sorry we had a little trouble in the beginning. I'd like to take any questions you may have.
We had one earlier from Yolande who said, where did Mary Walker get her medical training?
I don't know what college she went to, but she would have received a lot of objection to it. The colleges didn't want women in there because they felt they were occupying space that should be taken up by a man. But nevertheless, some of them managed to get in. Maybe she had family connections that got her in. But apparently she was a very good surgeon. She knew her business, and she won the Congressional Medal of Honor. She did a number of things. She was a remarkable woman. Who else has a question?
If anybody has any questions, there is the little chat window in the upper right. You can go ahead and click that open. I can see that. There you go. We have another question saying, who is the Black woman in the picture towards the end?
I don't know who she is. I was going through, and I wanted to show that even in the South, where there was so much objection to Black people, and they were treated like dirt, some people did well. You know, there's always people, no matter where they are, they're going to do well. They go into business. They're married to men who are successful because there weren't that many opportunities for women, particularly in the South, particularly for Black people. I don't know who she is, but you can tell by her dress that she apparently was a successful woman or married to somebody. But women like this generally were active in all kinds of activities.
Marilyn actually pipes in to say that Walker graduated from Syracuse Medical College. Good, interesting fact.
I don't know. I read when I first put this program together about 4 years ago, I would have done all that research. I would have known it then, but not now. Anybody else have a question?
Nope, not seeing anything. Just many thanks for the presentation tonight.
And again, you can't imagine how frustrating it is to try and access a program like this and not be able to do so. It's just feeling of total frustration. But I appreciate you all listening to this program and considering what our country's history is like. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, but it's our history. We have to deal with it.
We got
And
one last question. Did women inherit their husband's property?
well, I'm not an expert on that. I don't know what the legal ramifications were. I would assume that when a man died, he left his property to his wife and children. But I don't know what the circumstances were. But don't forget, some of these men are off to the war, to offices. The women were at home. They would have been managing their husband's affairs. This happens in every war. There's nothing new about this thing. But by the American Civil War, women are coming into their own, and they're starting to work at these jobs, and they're developing skills, administrative skills, that work for them in the 1870s and 80s and 90s when they're getting active in the suffragette movement and they're going into the workforce. This certainly would have been higher in the northern area, the large cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, maybe down south. But even so, in major southern cities like Atlanta, which was rebuilt fairly quickly, and Savannah, they would have been active in business there as well. Anyone else?
Sue wants to know, is there any books that you would recommend specifically that refer to women in the Civil War?
There are several, but I can't think of the names now. I would look for them. I would just Google it and do it. I think this particular program that you saw pretty well sums up everything. It took months to put this program together. And, I did it all, and most of it was done on Google. I also have an extensive library in my house on Civil War books, and I was able to refer to that. But Google really provides a tremendous amount of information. But I think what's happening is that more and more people are starting to pay attention to what women did in the Civil War. I'm not alone. My program is not unique. There are others just like it. You may want to try going on YouTube and saying, and this put it down as women in the American Civil War. There's all kinds of programs. Some are good and some are not so good. I've seen some mediocre ones on TV, but there are some very good ones out there.
Any more questions? Well, Martin will be doing another program. It's sometime beginning of May, is it, that we have one more with you?
Yes, we do, and that's going to be on, I think, hold on. It's May 3rd. It's Monday night at 7 o'clock. It's hallowed ground. It's what happened to the Civil War dead, how they were laid to rest. When I put that program together, it wasn't designed to be seen by the general public. It was designed only for Civil War clubs and historical societies, because it's a pretty gruesome subject. But to my astonishment, the program took off when the libraries found out about it. They had a big surge of interest in it. And I've been showing it all over the place. So that's what it'll be. If you want to know what happened to the Civil War soldiers, what Southern women did, it's a program you may want to see. May the 3rd.
Right. Thanks everyone for attending. Martin, thank you very much. It's been very informative. And hopefully we'll see you all come on May 3rd. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Have a good night.